The colony of New Avalon was meant to be a testament to humanity's progress, a thriving outpost on the frontier of the galaxy. Decades of effort, billions of credits, and the sacrifices of countless pioneers had gone into its establishment, symbolizing that humanity was no longer confined to Earth's cradle. Then in a single day, it was gone. The distress signal had been brief, a fragmented message intercepted by a passing trade vessel, before silence swallowed the colony whole. No survivors, no wreckage, just a barren, lifeless planet where a vibrant city had once stood. The attackers left nothing behind, no declaration, no warning, no name. They had simply wiped New Avalon from existence, as though it had never been. But humanity remembered, and humanity would not forgive. Admiral Jonathan Graves stood on the bridge of the UNS Retribution, staring at the tactical display before him. It was a monstrous sight, an armada unlike anything humanity had ever seen, assembled for a single purpose: revenge. 700,000 warships, the combined might of every Terran fleet, every colonial navy, every mercenary outfit willing to take up arms, from the smallest corvette to the behemoth dreadnoughts. The fleet stretched across the void, an unstoppable storm of fury. For the first time, humanity was united, not for politics, trade, or even survival, but for vengeance. ETA to enemy system? Graves asked. 4 days, Admiral, replied. His executive officer, Commander Vasquez, turning toward him with a grim nod. Scout drones have confirmed their presence. We know who did it. Graves exhaled sharply. Who? The Zorak Dominion. Vasquez's jaw tightened. An ancient warrior empire. We weren't even on their radar before. They probably saw us as just another minor race. Easy prey. A growl rumbled through the bridge crew. The Zorak had made a fatal mistake. Graves turned toward the massive viewport, his gaze piercing through the endless fleet surrounding his flagship. They thought wrong. The Zorak were old, an empire built on conquest, dominance, and the subjugation of dozens of species. They had crushed countless civilizations, burned worlds, and waged wars before humanity had even discovered fire. But for the first time in millennia, they had miscalculated. The humans were not like the others. They did not cower, beg, or submit. They brought war. 700,000 human warships arrived in Zorak space, a wall of fire and steel. The first planetary defense stations barely had time to raise shields before nuclear hellfire reduced them to molten slag. Their fleets scrambled, commanders barking orders in panic. They had expected a skirmish, perhaps a minor retaliatory raid. Instead, they were met with annihilation. Missiles streaked across the void by the millions. Kinetic slugs shattered battleships with ease. And when the human marines landed, they didn't take prisoners. One by one, the Zorak colonies fell. The once proud dominion, which had stood for millennia, began to crumble under the relentless force of human rage. There were no negotiations, no peace talks, only vengeance, and humanity was just getting started. The Zorak High Council had never known fear. For centuries they had ruled through terror. Their warriors were unmatched, their fleets unstoppable. But now, for the first time in their brutal history, they understood what it meant to be prey. Reports flooded in from across the Dominion. The humans had arrived in force. Their warships, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, moved with ruthless efficiency, obliterating every defensive line the Zorak had thrown in their path. Planets that had stood under the Dominion's rule for millennia were now reduced to smoldering wastelands. On the bridge of the Retribution, Admiral Graves listened to the latest battle reports. Sir, enemy stronghold on Vlok 7 neutralized. Resistance was heavier than expected, but ground forces secured the capital within 6 hours. Graves nodded. Casualties? The tactical officer hesitated. Minimal, sir. Less than 1,000 dead. 1,000 dead would have been a tragedy in any other war, but not this one. Not after what had happened to New Avalon. Graves turned, his attention to the holographic map of Zorak space. In just 2 weeks, a third of their empire had been reduced to ruins. "Admiral," Vasquez's voice was tight, "we've intercepted Zorak transmissions. They're calling for reinforcements. From their core systems, they're preparing for a last stand." Graves allowed himself a grim smile. "Good. Let them come." On the Zorak homeworld of Cathara, Supreme Warlord Zvir watched in horror as his empire crumbled. The humans had moved faster than he had anticipated. They didn't just fight. They destroyed entire fleets in hours, entire worlds reduced to ash. The humans had no interest in diplomacy, no hesitation, no mercy. A desperate council member spoke up. "We must surrender. Offer them whatever they want." Zvir bared his fangs. "They do not want surrender," he said coldly. "They want revenge," another councillor shuddered. "Then what do we do?" The warlord closed his eyes. He had studied the humans, underestimated them. He had assumed them weak, as so many other empires had. But now, as their ships darkened, his skies, he understood the truth. The humans were monsters, and there was no stopping them. The Zorak dominion was dying. Once, its fleets had ruled unchallenged, spreading across the galaxy like a plague, crushing species that dared resist. But now, that same dominion was burning. From the bridge of the Retribution, Admiral Graves watched the unfolding battle over Cathara. The holographic display flickered as fleet movements updated in real time. The human armada had arrived in full force, hundreds of thousands of warships forming an unbreakable wall in space. The Zorak fleet was vast, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and worst of all, outmatched by human fury. "Enemy forces engaging," Commander Vasquez reported. "They're throwing everything they have at us," Graves replied, his voice steady. He didn't blink. Vasquez's lips curled into a grim smirk. "They're dying fast." The battle was brutal, but the outcome had been decided long before the first shots were fired. The Zorak, for all their age and experience, had never faced anything like humanity before. Human warships didn't hold formation like the other species the Zorak had conquered. They didn't follow rigid tactics, didn't break under pressure. They adapted. They overwhelmed. They fought with a viciousness that terrified even the most seasoned Zorak warriors. Tactical nukes streaked through the void, detonating in the heart of enemy formations. Kinetic slugs, traveling at near light speeds, punched through battleships, reducing them to shredded wreckage. Swarms of fighter drones overwhelmed carriers, cutting through shields like razors. The Zorak fought desperately, their homeworld at stake, but it wasn't enough. "Admiral, the enemy flagship is in range," a lieutenant called out. Graves didn't hesitate. "Fire the Retribution's main cannon." A mass driver, the size of a skyscraper, roared to life. A tungsten round the size of a shuttle was launched at near relativistic speeds, smashing into the Zorak command ship before its shields could react. The vessel disintegrated instantly. A cheer erupted from the bridge, but Graves remained unmoved. "Status. On planetary defenses, surface cannons are still active, sir," Vasquez said, "but they're losing power fast. Our bombardment is breaking them apart." Graves nodded. "Then we move to the next phase." On the surface of Cathara, Supreme Warlord Zvir watched in horror as the sky turned to fire. Humanity's bombardment had begun. High above, the human fleet rained destruction upon his world. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to rubble in seconds. Entire mountain ranges shattered under orbital strikes. The oceans boiled as warships unleashed their fury. The Zorak had waged war for centuries. They had committed genocide against dozens of species. They had believed themselves unstoppable. But now, as their world was torn apart, they knew fear. Transmission flickered on the warlord's command screen. A human face appeared. Admiral Graves. His expression was unreadable. "This is what happens when you cross humanity," Graves said, his voice like cold steel. "You wiped out our colony. You thought you could erase us." He leaned closer to the screen. "Now we erase you." Zvir swallowed his pride. He had never begged before, but now he had no choice. "Human," he growled, lowering his head slightly. "We surrender." There was a long silence. Then Graves spoke. "No." The transmission cut out. A moment later, the sky split apart as the final bombardment began. Cathara burned. The war was over, and humanity had won. She said the fleet had begun to withdraw. The remaining Zorks, too weak to fight or too broken to resist, watched in stunned silence as the human armada vanished into the void. They had been defeated so utterly that their survival now depended on the mercy of the very species they had once sought to erase. Humanity had won. But Admiral Graves knew that somewhere, sometime, another enemy would rise, and when they did, humanity would be ready. The Zorks' dominion was no more. What remained of their once mighty civilization had crumbled into scattered ruins and broken survivors. Their great fleets were now nothing more than drifting wreckage lost in the void. Across what was once their empire, Terran warships loomed, like silent ghosts, ensuring that no remnant of Zork's military power would ever rise again. But even in defeat, the Zorks endured. Graves understood this war had never been only about vengeance. It had been a statement, a declaration that humanity would never again be prey, and the galaxy had heard that message loud and clear. 6 months after the fall of Cathara, the echoes of war still rippled across the stars. Humanity had changed. The United Terran Directorate had become something more, stronger, more unified, and far more feared. The sight of a Terran warship was now enough to make entire planets rethink their allegiances. Diplomats from every known system scrambled to sign treaties, forge alliances, or at least ensure they'd never be seen as a threat. But whispers spread through the void, concerned voices questioning what humanity had become. The war had been justified. Every species once crushed beneath Zork's rule had celebrated their fall. But a quiet fear lingered now. If humanity could annihilate a millennia-old empire in mere months, what would they do to anyone who stood in their way? On Earth, the streets of every major city overflowed with celebration. Monuments were raised to honor the fallen of New Avalon. Veterans were hailed as heroes. News outlets, broadcasts, and official speeches all declared the same truth. Humanity had won. Humanity had secured its place among the stars. But behind the parades, the war had left its scars. Graves saw it in the soldiers returning from Cathara, the coldness in their eyes, the way they spoke of the Zorks as if they had never been sentient. The war hadn't just broken an empire, it had hardened a species, and perhaps, Graves thought, that was necessary. Standing in his office aboard the newly commissioned UNS Eternity, Graves reviewed a classified report. Intelligence confirmed what he had already suspected. Not everyone had been terrified by humanity's rise. Some had been watching, calculating. A new power had begun to stir on the edges of known space. An alliance of once rival species, now united by a singular fear. Humanity. They had seen what the Terrans were capable of, and they had decided to act before it was too late. Graves closed the file. The Zorks had been the first. They would not be the last. And if the galaxy wanted to test humanity again, it would burn. 6 months after the fall of the Zork's dominion, humanity stood unmatched. Its fleets were the most feared force in known space. Its soldiers, forged in fire, were hardened beyond measure. Every species that had once dismissed Earth now watched with wary eyes, but not all watched in silence. A storm was coming. Admiral Graves sat in the war room aboard the UNS Eternity, the new flagship of the Terran Directorate. Holographic projections flickered around him. Intel gathered from every border system. The signs were unmistakable. They call themselves the Accord of Sovereign Worlds, Vasquez reported, her voice sharp and steady. 5 species, once enemies, now allied with a single purpose, containing us. Graves exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing on the display. The Accord wasn't just a political alliance. It was an emergency coalition formed by civilizations who had waged war against one another for centuries. Now, they had set aside their hatred because they feared something more. They feared humanity. Across the table, General O'Neill let out a low chuckle. 5 entire species uniting just to stop little Oldus. That's almost flattering. No, Graves replied coldly. It's dangerous. The Zorks had been powerful, but isolated, arrogant. The Accord was different. It was coordinated, intelligent, and it had one goal: to ensure humanity never again wielded the kind of power it had used to wipe out an empire. They're already mobilizing, Vasquez continued. Border systems reinforced, fleets doubled. We've intercepted communications, joint military exercises, strategic deployments. They're preparing for war. Graves leaned back, fingers steepled. The war against the Zorks had been swift and brutal, but this would be something else entirely. He turned to O'Neill. Status of our forces? The general's smirk faded into something darker. Stronger than ever. The fall of New Avalon lit a fire across every colony. Recruitment's at an all-time high. We're producing warships and weapons at record pace because people know what's coming. Graves nodded slowly. Humanity had won its war of vengeance, but the cost had been transformation. They were no longer a species seeking peace. They were something else now, something dangerous. We need to strike first, Vasquez said firmly. We can't let them box us in. Graves was silent for a long moment. He stared at the galactic map, vast, cold, filled with hostile factions, marked in red. The Accord thought they could contain humanity, thought they could leash the force that had shattered an empire. They were wrong. Graves stood. Prepare the fleets. Vasquez and O'Neill exchanged a glance. We're going to.
Va?
O'Neill asked, though his voice held no doubt. Graves' eyes were like steel. We never stopped. The galaxy had drawn its line. Now humanity would show them what it meant to cross it. The stars braced for war. The Accord of Sovereign Worlds. 5. Powerful civilizations, sworn enemies now bound by a shared fear. They had reinforced their borders, constructed vast armadas, and prepared for a prolonged campaign. They believed they could intimidate humanity. They were wrong. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the UNS Eternity, staring at the tactical display. Red markers stretched across the map. Accord fleets stationed along every hyperlane into Terran space. The blockade was nearly complete, a warning, a provocation. Graves didn't hesitate. All fleets, prepare for engagement. There was no protest, no diplomacy. The time for negotiation had passed the moment the Accord declared humanity a threat. Now, there was only war. The UNS Eternity led the first strike in the Solari system. On the opposing side, High Warden Threx of the Accord watched in disbelief as thousands of Terran ships exited hyperspace in perfect formation. Impossible, he muttered. He had expected a build-up, delays, talks. But humanity hadn't waited. They had come to kill. Alarms blared across the Accord command deck as fighter swarms launched and kinetic batteries powered up. Humanity had fired the first shot, and they weren't holding back. Raise shields, return fire. Threx roared. But it was too late. The first battle lasted under an hour. The Accord's defensive fleet was obliterated. What was meant to be an impenetrable blockade became a massacre. The UNS Eternity alone shattered 3 capital ships with surgical orbital strikes. Railgun rounds traveling at near-light speeds punched through hulls like they were paper. The survivors scattered. The message was clear. Humanity would not be contained, and the galaxy listened. The galaxy species watched in stunned silence as human forces pushed forward, smashing through the Accord's defenses with ruthless efficiency on the Accord's council world of Vandros Prime. The ruling species gathered in a desperate emergency session. Holograms flickered with footage of human warships carving through their fleet's soldiers in advanced power armor, storming planetary defenses. They don't fight like the Zorak, a caviar diplomat hiss. They don't hold formations, they don't retreat, they don't hesitate. A Gari warlord slammed his fist against the table. Then we need to strike harder. We outnumber them, 5-1. A solemn voice cut through the argument. It doesn't matter. All eyes turned to the celery, representative his species had fought. Humanity at the Solari system, they had seen what the others had not. They fight like they've already won, he said. Silence fell over the chamber. The war had only just begun, and already the Accord was afraid on the bridge of the Eternity Graves watched. As his fleet spread like wildfire, planets fell. Enemy fleets were obliterated, and the Accord's line scrambled faster than anyone had predicted. But he knew this was only the beginning. They would regroup. They would strike back. Good, let them try Graves. Turn to Vasquez, prepare the next assault. We take the Caviar stronghold next. Vasquez nodded, and after that Graves's lips curled into a cold smile. We don't stop until they beg for mercy. The war had begun, and humanity would finish it. The Accord was reeling. What was supposed to be a containment effort had turned into an unrelenting nightmare. Human warships had torn through the Solari system, leaving behind only wreckage and death. The outer defenses of the Accord had been shattered in days, not months, and now the United Terran Directorate was pushing deeper into enemy space. Admiral Graves stood at the heart of it all, watching as the greatest military machine humanity had ever built ground its enemies to dust. The Caviar stronghold was next. An ancient race, the Caviar, had once been warlords who dominated entire sectors. Their home world, Vandros 9, was a fortress protected by planetary shields, automated defense turrets, and a fleet stationed in permanent orbit. It was considered an impenetrable bastion. Humanity didn't care. The UNS Eternatil, the charge, backed by the 2nd and 5th Expeditionary Fleet 7, warships more than the Zorak had ever faced at once, surged forward. They merged from hyperspace in a perfect formation, their arrival accompanied by the deafening silence of the void. Just before hell erupted, Caviar warships launched interceptors, and missile swarms, energy cannons powered up, and planetary defense systems locked onto human vessels. The battlefield became a swirling storm of plasma fire, railgun rounds, and detonations as both sides clashed. But the humans had come prepared, tactical. AI synchronized the fleet's movements with near-perfect precision. Capital ships laid down devastating suppressive fire, while smaller strike groups weaved through the chaos, cutting through Caviar defenses like blades through flesh. The Yan Saturnity deployed its Dredden-class railguns, each round traveling at near light speed, obliterating enemy ships in single shots on the bridge. Graves watched the chaos unfold. Planetary shields are holding. Vasquez reported WEC. Need ground for Sesto breach. Graves nodded. The Marines. The Order sent thousands of drop pods screaming through Vros 99's atmosphere. The planetary shields, weakened by the orbital bombardment, flickered as the first wave broke through. Then the real battle began. General O'Neill led the charge, clad in advanced power armor, wielding a high-caliber plasma rifle. He and his troops stormed the capital city of Luos Prime. The Caviar had deployed thousands of ground troops, their towering war machines lumbering through the streets, firing barrages of plasma fire. But human soldiers weren't just warriors, they were killers. O'Neill's men moved in tight, efficient squads. Drones scouted enemy positions, feeding real-time data to combat HUD's grenades, arced over cover. EMP bursts disabled enemy. Mechs and sniper teams eliminated Caviar officers with terrifying precision. A massive Caviar Walker turned the corner, its heavy cannons glowing. O'Neill didn't hesitate. He raised his wrist, marking the target with a simple voice command. Valkyrie strike. Sector 3B from above, a hypersonic human aircraft screamed downward, releasing a payload of tungsten rods. The projects accelerated to near-terminal velocity, struck the walker like meteors, reducing it to molten slag. O'Neill grinned. Push forward, the battle raged for hours. Streets burned, buildings crumbled, and the once mighty caviar warriors fell one by one. They had expected a siege. Instead, they got an execution by nightfall. The caviar government was in ruins. Vandross 9, once a stronghold, was now just another human conquest. O'Neill stood atop the shattered remains of the Caviar Command Center, raising the Terran banner as his troops cheered. Humanity had claimed another world on the bridge of the Eternity Graves. Listened to the victory reports. In silence, the Accord was losing fast. Vasquez exhaled. They never had a chance. Graves didn't smile. They still think they do, he said. And that makes them dangerous. Vasquez frowned. You think they'll retaliate? Graves nodded. They have no choice there. Only hope is a counterattack before we steamroll them completely. O'Neill's voice crackled over the Cal. What's next? Admiral Graves stared at the galactic map, his eyes locked on the next major Accord stronghold. We keep going. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The Accord was desperate. Humanity had turned their containment effort into a full-scale slaughter, sweeping through star systems with unrelenting force. The fall of Vandross 9 sent shockwaves through the galactic community. What was once a mighty caviar stronghold had been reduced to rubble in mere days. Now every species in the Accord knew one thing for certain: if they didn't stop humanity, now they never would. And so they planned their counterstrike deep within the Accord's central command station on Zera Prime. The leaders of the 5-member coalition gathered. Holograms of burning cities and shattered fleets played around them. The brutal efficiency of humanity. War machine, undeniable. This cannot continue. Warlord Jir of the Caviar snarled, his claws flexing against the conference table. They have no mercy, no restraint. If we hesitate, they will burn our home worlds next. The Gari diplomat Riol hissed in agreement. We underestimated them. We assumed they would fight with hesitation, with politics in mind. His eyes flickered with an eerie glow. Instead, they fight like they were born for this. The Solari representative, one of the few survivors from the first engagement, looked grim. We must strike at their heart, not skirmishes, not battles, a killing blow. The room fell silent. They all knew what he meant: Earth. The Accord's plan was simple: strike where humanity was most vulnerable. Their fleets were powerful, their armies unstoppable, but Earth was their home, their legacy, their pride. If the Accord could burn Earth, they could break humanity's will to fight. They assembled a fleet unlike anything seen before. Over 20 warships crewed by the best soldiers and tacticians. Their species had to offer. Every last resource was poured into this mission. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had, and so they launched their assault on the bridge of the UNS Eternity. Admiral Graves stood motionless, eyes fixed on the tactical display. Red markers, thousands of them, swarmed toward Earth. The largest enemy fleet humanity had ever faced. The room was dead silent. Even Vasquez, usually unshaken, paled at the sight. They're going for Earth, she whispered. O'Neill's voice came through the calms, cold and sharp. They want to break us. Graves exhaled slowly, then turned to his officers. His voice carried through the bridge with unshakable resolve. Then let's teach them what happens when you back humanity into a corner. The Battle of Earth would be remembered for millennia. The Accord fleet exited hyperspace just beyond the Sol system, weapons primed, expecting to find Earth vulnerable. Instead, they found the largest human armada ever assembled. 100 warships. Every Terran fleet had been recalled. Every colony had sent reinforcements. Every last resource humanity could muster had been funneled into this moment. The Accord expected a battle. What they got was an extinction event. the void between. The fleets turned into a hellscape of fire and destruction. Human dreadnoughts unleashed railgun, rounds the size of city buses, tearing through enemy ships like paper. Swarms of teen fighter craft moved with coordinated precision, executing complex maneuvers that shattered enemy formations. The Eternity spearheaded the assault, its experimental weapon system scutting through the largest Accord warships with ease. Plasma lances seared through hulls, while kinetic slugs turned battle cruisers into drifting debris. The Accord fought back with everything they had, their warships outnumbered. Humanity's but numbers didn't matter anymore. Humanity had been fighting. This war for survival from the moment New Avalon burned, they had been reforged in blood and fire, and now they were unstoppable on the Accord command ship. Panic spread. "They're overwhelming us," a Solari officer cried out. "We can't," a kinetic round slammed through the command deck, tearing half the ship apart in an instant. Explosions rippled through the fleet as ship after ship was obliterated. Admiral Graves watched it all unfold. Eyes, cold voice, steady show, them no mercy. The battle lasted 12 hours. By the end, the Accord fleet was gone 20. Idzozo's warships had entered Sol. None had survived. Humanity had won. The Accord had gambled everything and lost. Their military was broken. Their leadership shattered. The survivors fled. Their coalition in ruins on Earth. Billions of humans cheered. Across the stars, colonies rejoiced, but on the bridge of the Eternity, Admiral Graves wasn't celebrating. He knew what came next. This war wasn't over. It was time to take the fight to them. Humanity would not be contained. Humanity would rule. The war was no longer about survival. Humanity had crushed the Accord's attempt to wipe out Earth. Their 20 Udrero ship armada had been annihilated. Their fleet shattered, their military left in ruins. But Admiral Graves knew one truth about war. If you left the enemy alive, they would return, and humanity did not believe in second chances. Now it was time for vengeance. The invasion of the Accord's core worlds began with brutal efficiency. Humanity launched a campaign that spanned entire star systems. Every fleet, every warship, every soldier that Earth could spare was mobilized. The days of defending human space were over now. Humanity was bringing the war to the Accord's doorstep. The first target, the Gari homeworld, the planet Zos 4, was a technological marvel. Massive orbital stations, planetary defense grids, and an Artif IAL ring around the planet that housed most of their industrial power and had stood untouched for centuries. No enemy had ever breached its defenses. Then humanity arrived, 700. Udrozro warships had gathered in Earth's defense. Now they moved outward like a vengeful storm sweeping through space, leaving nothing but debris behind. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the Eternity, watching the planet loom closer. A cold fury burned. In his chest, he had lost friends. He had watched the Accord massacre human colonies, had seen innocent families burned from orbit. No, it was their turn to suffer. All ships, Grav said, his voice like steel, commenced bombardment. The sky above Zos 4 burned. Human dreadnoughts unleashed tungsten rods, the size of skyscrapers, each one slamming into the surface with the force of a nuclear detonation. Plasma lances scut through orbital stations, sending fire and wreckage spiraling toward the planet below Gari. Warships scrambled to defend their home, but they were already too late. Human fighter squadrons weaved through their defenses, precision striking shield generators and key infrastructure. Special forces teams deployed onto the surface, assassinating high-value targets before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The Gari had once prided themselves on their tactical superiority. Now they were running for their lives. General O'Neill led the ground assault as the first waves of dropships broke. Through the planet's atmosphere, anti-air defenses opened fire, filling the sky with plasma bolts. Some human ships were hit, spiraling into the cityscape below, but most made it through. O'Neill and his men landed in the middle of the Gari capital. The City was already in chaos. Fires raged through towering skyscrapers. The streets were filled with terrified civilians, scrambling for cover as human mechs marched through the rebel. The Gari military tried to push back their shock troopers, clad in advanced battle armor, engaged the human marines in brutal street combat energy weapons. Flared explosions ripped through buildings, and screams echoed through the burning ruins. But the humans had come prepared. Sniper teams eliminated Gari. Officers, before they could issue orders, drone swarms overloaded enemy targeting systems. EMP strikes disabled their tanks, leaving them vulnerable to devastating missile barges. O'Neill's team moved fast, cutting through enemy resistance like a scalpel. As they pushed toward the Gari command center, he activated his comm admiral. The capital's defenses are collapsing. The enemy is in full retreat. Graves's voice came through, cold and merciless. Then finish it. O'Neill did not hesitate. He raised his plasma rifle and led his men forward. By nightfall, Zos 4 belonged to humanity. The Gari government had been executed. The remaining military forces surrendered, and those who didn't, they were wiped out across the planet. Human forces secured control. Their flag was raised above the ruins of the capital, a grim reminder that humanity did not forgive. The Accord had thought they could exterminate humans. Instead, they'd sealed their own fate. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the Eternity, watching the burning PL planet below. Vasquez exhaled. That's 2 core worlds down. O'Neill's voice came through the comm again. The Gari are done. What's next? Graves didn't even blink. The Solari home world. Vasquez's eyes flickered with dark amusement. We're not stopping, are we? Graves turned towards the galactic map, showing the remaining Accord worlds. His jaw tightened. They wanted a war. He said, voice low, dangerous now. We give them one. The conquest of the Accord had begun, and humanity would not stop until the galaxy was theirs. The Solari homeworld of Vajir was the jewel of the Accord. It was a planet of towering crystalline spires, floating citadels, and lush bioluminescent forests that stretched for miles. Unlike the industrial worlds of the Garior, the war-forged fortresses of the Kavir Vajir was a place of peace, art, and diplomacy. It had never seen war on its surface until now. Admiral Graves stared at the holographic projection of the planet, even from orbit. Vazir was breathtaking, its twin moons casting a pale glow over the sapphire oceans. He almost felt bad for what was about to happen. Almost. The Solari were the ones who started this war. Vasquez muttered, standing beside him. They whispered in the ears of the other species, pushed them to attack. Our colonies now look where it got them. Graves didn't respond. Instead, he turned to his officers. Deploy the Fleet 700. Idaizo 0 warships burned through the void, their engines leaving trails of fire as they descended upon Vajir. Cellaride fence stations scrambled to react, their fleet mobilizing in a desperate attempt to repel the invasion. Their warships were sleek, elegant, built for precision strikes rather than brute force. They had been designed to win through diplomacy, through superior tactics, through carefully calculated engagements. They had never fought an enemy like humanity. The first exchange lasted minutes. The Solari fleet opened fire, unleashing energy lances that cut through space with pinpoint accuracy. Human dreadnoughts responded with brutal efficiency. Railguns the size of skyscrapers fired hypersonic rounds that tore through shields, slicing ships in half before their crews could even react. Missiles swarmed through the battlefield, artificial intelligence guiding them past countermeasures, slamming into holes with devastating force. The Solari fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing against overwhelming firepower. In less than an hour, their navy was gone. Planetary defenses activated. Vajir's surface was protected by a shield network designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The Solari had believed it was impenetrable, an absolute safeguard against any invasion. They were wrong. Humanity had already faced these kinds of defenses in past battles. They had learned, they had adapted. A fleet of stealth bombers slipped past the outer defenses, deploying specialized payloads designed to overload shield harmonics. The moment the energy field flickered even for a second, human battleships unleashed their full might. Tungsten rods fell. From orbit striking with the force of nuclear warheads, the first impact turned a city into dust. The second cracked the surface of a continent. The shield network collapsed within minutes. The invasion had begun. General O'Neill led the first wave drop. Ships descended through the atmosphere, dodging sporadic anti-air fire as they deployed human forces across key strategic points. The Celery had no standing army. Their soldiers were ceremonial, trained for peacekeeping, not while they were slaughtered. Mechs the size of buildings marched through the elegant cities, their plasma cannons cutting down whatever resistance remained. Drone swarms blanketed the skies, seeking out and destroying enemy strongholds before they could organize. O'Neill and his Marines pushed through the capital, moving street by street. Civilians screamed in terror as the fighting drew closer. Some tried to run, others begged for mercy. O'Neill gave none. These were the same people who had signed the order to exterminate. Human colonies, the same people who had watched as Vandros 9 burned, as billions of innocent lives were wiped out. Now it was their turn. The Solari Council was holed up in their grand palace, a floating fortress suspended above the capital it had been. Their center of power for centuries, a place where they had dictated the fate of countless civilizations. Now it was nothing more than a target. Human strike teams infiltrated the palace, moving like shadows through its halls. Security forces put up a token resistance, but they were no match for cybernetically enhanced operatives trained for planetary subjugation. Within an hour, the council was dragged from their chambers. O'Neill stood over them, his expression unreadable. The Solari leader, an elder, with shimmering silver skin, looked up at them with desperate eyes. "Please," she whispered, "we surrender." O'Neill tilted his head as if considering her words. Then he activated his Cal Admiral Graves. "The council is secured." Orders. There was a long pause, then Graves's voice came through, cold and final. "No survivors." O'Neill nodded. He raised his rifle. The war crime tribunals would be held later by humans. For humans, the Solari Council would not live to see them by nightfall. Vajir was in flames. The floating citadels fell from the sky, the forests burned, the oceans turned black with ash, and above the planet, the human fleet stood watch. Vasquez let out a breath. "That's 3 core worlds down." O'Neill's voice crackled through the comms. "The sealer are finished." "What's next?" Graves didn't hesitate. "The Caviar homeworld." Vasquez grinned. The warriors. Graves's jaw tightened. "The last obstacle." The Cav were different. They were not diplomats. They were not politicians. They were warriors. And if humanity wanted to break the accord completely, they would have to face the deadliest fighters in the galaxy, and winter war against the Cord was nearing its final chapter. The Caviar home. World Dracos stood as the last bastion of their alliance. Unlike the Selda and Gari, the Caviar did not beg for mercy. They did not surrender. They were warriors bred for battle, a species that had conquered and crushed lesser civilizations for centuries. But they had never faced humanity at its most ruthless. Admiral Graves knew this would be different. Unlike the previous invasions, this would not be a slaughter. The Caviar would fight to the last soldier, to the last breath. There would be no pleas for mercy, no desperate peace offerings. And so humanity came prepared. The battle for Dracos was the bloodiest of the war. The Caviar fleets did not break upon the first engagement. Their warships were built like fortresses covered in thick armor plating, bristling with weapons designed for relentless combat. They did not retreat, did not falter, but they did fall. Humanity's fleet moved with surgical precision. Railguns punched through even the thickest holes. Missiles found the cracks in their defenses, and electronic warfare teams scrambled their communications, cutting them off from each The fight dragged on for days, but one by one, the caviar warships were reduced to smoldering wreckage, and then the invasion began on the surface. The caviar made their final stand. Their warriors fought like demons, refusing to give ground, turning every ruined city into a fortress, every street into a battlefield, even as orbital bombardments shattered their defenses, even as mechs and tanks crushed their lines, they kept fighting. Humanity had never faced an enemy so unyielding. But in the end, it didn't matter. The caviar had centuries of battle experience, but humanity had something greater: adaptability. They learned, adjusted, countered every tactic thrown at them. What should have been a month-long siege was over in a matter of weeks. The caviar high command was wiped out. Their last warriors fell, refusing to surrender. Dracos burned. The Accord was no more. Admiral Graves stood aboard the Eternity, watching the ruined surface of the last enemy world. He had thought he would feel something: relief, triumph, even satisfaction. Instead, there was only silence. Vasquez broke it. "We did it." Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "It's over," Graves exhaled. "No." He turned to the galactic map. The stars stretched out before him, vast and endless. This was just the beginning. O'Neill's voice crackled over the comms. "We've taken their worlds." What now? Graves's gaze was cold, unreadable. "We're build, expand, secure our place in the galaxy." He looked at the shattered remains of the once mighty Accord. "And we make sure, no species ever threatens humanity again." The war was over, but humanity's dominion had just begun.